Everyone in Silver Ridge remembered the morning my name became poison on every neighbor's tongue. But few knew the real reason behind it. They thought I was just an old rancher who built a fence. What they didn't know was that I used to wear a black robe that carried the weight of federal law. That day started like any other in Texas. The sun crawled slow over the horizon, painting the pastures gold. My cattle grazed quietly, tails swishing against the morning flies. I sipped coffee on the porch, the kind of peace I'd worked decades to earn after retiring from the courthouse. For a brief moment, it felt like the world was still honest. Simple. Then the sound came. An engine, purring too aggressively for this land. A white Mercedes SUV climbed my gravel drive, scattering dust like it was claiming the place. My jaw tightened. Everyone in Silver Ridge knew who drove that car. Karen Blackwood. She was the self-crowned queen of the HOA. Heels clicking, suit pressed, her blonde hair unmoved by the breeze. She stepped out like she owned my ranch. In her manicured hands, a thick envelope. She didn't even say hello. "Mr. Thornfield," she announced, voice sharp enough to cut wire. "I'm here on official HOA business regarding your recent, unauthorized construction." She pointed toward the fence I'd built along the eastern border. Cedar posts, hand-dug, rails strong enough to hold cattle during the storm season. Nothing fancy, nothing harmful. Just a rancher protecting his herd. Set my coffee down, stood, and kept my voice calm. "Morning, Karen. What seems to be the problem?" The problem, she explained, was that I had violated Section 427 of the Community Covenant by building without HOA approval. She opened her envelope like it contained national secrets and handed me a notice on expensive letterhead. The fine? $250,000, I stared at the number not because I couldn't pay it, but because of the sheer audacity. 25 years on the federal bench had taught me the difference between justice and intimidation, and this smelled of the latter. Karen expected me to break, to beg, maybe even to panic. Instead, I looked past her at Tom Carter, the HOA secretary slouched in the passenger seat. His eyes said it all. Regret, fear, maybe even shame. Karen's smile sharpened when I didn't flinch. "You have 7 days to remove the fence, 30 days to pay the fine. Non-compliance will trigger foreclosure proceedings." She turned, heels clicking, and left me standing in the dust. My cattle mooed, as if mocking the absurdity of it all. I walked back inside, past the old law books that lined my shelves, to the closet where a black suit jacket hung quietly in the shadows. My fingers brushed against the fabric. It had been years since I wore it. But maybe it was time. 3 days. Later, Karen still hadn't left me alone. Rumors were spreading through Silver Ridge that I was reckless, dangerous, a man who didn't respect property values. Neighbors I'd shared coffee with crossed the street to avoid me. Some whispered that Karen planned to seize my ranch altogether. That morning, Betty Martinez knocked on my door, casserole dish in hand, worry etched on her face. Betty was old Silver Ridge, back before the developers carved it into a plastic paradise with rules for every flower bed. She'd seen what the HOA had become, and she hated it. "Marcus," she said, settling into my kitchen chair like family. "Karen's calling an emergency board meeting. She's bringing in that lawyer from Austin, Raymond Cole. Word is, they're planning to make an example out of you." I nodded, listening. My mind automatically dissected everything Betty said. Lack of due process, excessive fines, no appeals. I'd seen this before. Not in ranch land, but in civil rights cases where small groups abuse power because no one stopped them. "What would you say?" I asked her quietly. "If I told you what Karen's doing might not be legal at all?" Her eyes lit up, part hope, part defiance. "I'd say it's about time someone stood up to her." That night, I drove into town, straight to the HOA office. a modest building Karen had transformed into her private courthouse. I asked for the records. The young receptionist hesitated but let me in. What I found made my blood run hot. Incomplete financial reports, meeting minutes that skipped over resident notices, the so-called Architectural Review Committee, just Karen, and her two closest allies. And worst of all, covenant enforcement procedures rewritten multiple times to strip away resident rights. No appeals, no hearings, just punishment. I photographed everything. Walking out, I caught sight of Tom Carter. Again, he hesitated, then walked over. His voice was low, shaking. "Mr. Thornfield, not all of us agree with what's happening. Karen's pushing hard, but we don't even know if it's legal." I met his eyes. "What would happen, Tom, if someone challenged the board's authority in court?" He swallowed hard. "Honestly, none of us know." I got in my truck, watching him disappear into the shadows. The envelope from Karen still sat on my table at home, demanding $250,000 for a fence. But I knew now, this was bigger than me. Silver Ridge had become a playground for bureaucratic bullies, and they thought no one had the backbone to fight back. They were wrong, because I wasn't just Marcus the rancher. I was Marcus J. Thornfield, federal judge, retired. And if Karen wanted a war, she had just picked the wrong battlefield. Everyone expected me to fold. That was Karen's entire strategy. Overwhelm a man with fear until he broke. But what she hadn't accounted for was that I'd spent 30 years watching seasoned attorneys crumble in my courtroom. Pressure didn't scare me. In fact, it sharpened me. The night of the emergency HOA meeting, the Silver Ridge Community Center buzzed with nervous energy. I chose my seat in the very back where the shadows gave me cover. The place was packed, residents shifting in their chairs, whispers passing like wildfire. They all knew this meeting wasn't just about a fence. It was about control. Karen sat at the head table, her posture rigid, her laptop and binders stacked, like weapons. Tom Carter sat stiffly to her right, avoiding my eyes, and next to her, the man I'd heard so much about, Raymond Cole. He looked exactly as I expected, expensive suit, silver hair, a smile that had probably cost clients millions. When Karen introduced him, her voice dripped with reverence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Mr. Raymond Cole, one of the finest community association attorneys in Texas." The residents leaned forward, intimidated before he even spoke. Raymond stood, his movements polished, his tone heavy with authority. "I've reviewed the Thornfield case," he began, clicking through a PowerPoint that glowed on the wall. "This is not just about one man's fence. This is about whether Silver Ridge will uphold the principles of community standards. If we let this violation go unchecked, property values will plummet. Your investments, your homes, your futures, all at risk." Fear rippled through the room. People shifted uneasily, eyes darting toward me in the back row. Raymond pressed on, citing case after case, impressive to anyone unfamiliar with the law. But I knew better. His examples were pulled from commercial property disputes, industrial, code violations, completely irrelevant to a wooden fence on a cattle ranch. He was bluffing with legal jargon, and the room was swallowing every word. Karen nodded along, her smile triumphant. She thought she'd found her hammer, and I was the nail. But then something unexpected happened. Betty Martinez raised her hand. Her voice carried the calm of someone who'd lived too long under intimidation to care anymore. "Mr. Cole, what exactly gives the HOA the right to charge $250,000 for a simple fence? That seems more than a little excessive." Raymond's smile flickered. He launched into a polished explanation about protecting property values, but he never addressed the heart of her question, proportionality. I saw several heads nodding in agreement with Betty. Doubt was creeping into the room. Then another resident spoke up. "What about appeals? Don't we get a chance to fight fines like this?" This time, Raymond's response chilled the room. According to him, residents forfeited their right to challenge enforcement if they hadn't sought prior approval for construction. Legal nonsense. Flat out contrary to due process. But to the untrained ear, it sounded final. Binding. Terrifying. I leaned back in my chair, fingers tracing the worn edge of the Federal Registry I'd brought with me. On page 47, I'd marked a case that would shatter his entire argument. Morrison v. Hillrest Community Association. The court had ruled enforcement procedures invalid for lacking due process, and here in Silver Ridge, the HOA had been denying residents hearings for years. I closed the book slowly, my mind already sharpening. Thusty. Meeting dragged on, Raymond outlining enhanced enforcement procedures that would bypass appeals altogether. Residents whispered nervously. Some nodded in fear. Karen practically glowed. But Tom Carter? He looked sick. His hand trembled every time he took a note. I caught his eye for a brief second, and in that moment, I saw a man torn in half, loyalty to his neighbors on one side, fear of Karen on the other. When the meeting ended, residents filed out in silence, weighed down by fear and confusion. I waited until most had gone, then approached the head table. Raymond extended his hand, smile still practiced. Mr. Thornfield, I trust tonight clarified the situation for you. I shook his hand firmly, my eyes locked on his. Very educational, Mr. Cole. Though I did notice you cited Morrison versus Hillrest as precedent for your enforcement slide. His smile faltered. For the first time all night, his confidence cracked. He hadn't expected a rancher to recognize case law, much less cite it back to him. Karen's head snapped between us, confusion dawning in her eyes. I offered nothing more than a polite nod and walked away, leaving them to stew in the silence I'd planted. A single seed of doubt, but I knew it would grow. That night, back at the ranch, I opened my closet and took out the black suit jacket. My fingers traced the small American flag pin on the lapel. The weight of it grounded me, reminded me who I really was. I wasn't just fighting for a fence. I was fighting for every resident too afraid to speak. The next morning, my study filled with papers, law books, and memories I thought I'd left behind. I reviewed the Texas Property Code. I reread the Civil Rights Act. And page after page, the truth crystallized. Silver Ridge HOA wasn't just overstepping. They were systematically violating constitutional rights. Betty arrived around noon with sandwiches, her eyes full of fire. Marcus, people are scared. Karen's threatening inspections if anyone sides with you. Jennifer Walsh says she wants to speak up, but Karen threatened to dig into her rose garden permits. I listened, jaw tight. It wasn't just my fence. It was extortion, plain and simple. A shadow government running unchecked. Finally, I set my coffee down and told her the truth. Betty, there's something you don't know about me. I handed her a framed photo from my courthouse days. Black robe, flag behind me, gavel in, hand. 30 years of service etched into a single image. Her hand covered her mouth. Marcus, you're that Judge Thornfield? The one who ruled on those civil rights cases in Houston? I nodded slowly. She smiled then, not with surprise, but with relief. Then maybe, just maybe, this community finally has a fighting chance. And in that moment, I knew the quiet life I'd built here was over. Silver Ridge wanted a war, and I was ready to give them one. The morning after Raymond's little show, I woke with a feeling I hadn't known in years. Clarity. My coffee tasted stronger, the sunrise brighter. Even my cattle seemed calmer, like they could sense something was shifting. I walked to the closet, pulled down that black suit jacket and held it in my hands. For 8 years, I'd pretended I was just Marcus the rancher. But the truth was, I was Judge Marcus J. Thornfield. and I had never forgotten how to dismantle arrogance hiding behind law. By mid-morning, my study looked like a war room. Federal case law scattered across the desk. Constitutional commentary, stacked high. My fingers moved with a rhythm I hadn't felt since retirement. Due process, excessive fines, civil rights violations under color of law. Every angle sharpened, every precedent marked. What Karen and her allies had been doing wasn't just wrong, it was unconstitutional. They were wielding power they never legally had, like children playing dress-up in the uniforms of authority. At noon, Betty arrived with sandwiches again, her face lined with urgency. She set the food down without ceremony. Marcus, people are scared. Karen's making her rounds, telling everyone you're trying to destroy the community. She's even hinting that supporting you could mean problems. I leaned back, listening as she listed names. Jennifer Walsh, terrified of losing her rose garden. Families warned about their swing sets. Residents told their landscaping could be ripped out if they questioned the board. It wasn't governance. It was extortion. Finally, I told Betty the whole truth. She deserved it. Betty, you're not talking to just another rancher. You're talking to a federal judge who spent 3 decades protecting rights in a courtroom. And Karen, she's about to find out exactly what that means. I showed her the framed photo from my time on the bench. Her eyes widened, then softened, into a smile that looked like hope finally remembered. I knew there was more to you, Marcus, she whispered. Now we've got a fighting chance. With Betty as my eyes and ears in the neighborhood, I started building. Evidence first. HOA records that proved their procedures were illegal. Witnesses who'd been silenced by threats. Financial documents showing fines funneled straight into the pockets of lawyers like Raymond Cole. By evening, the picture was undeniable. This wasn't a community board. It was a racket, dressed up in bylaws and fancy letterhead. Then came the knock at my door. Tom Carter stood there looking like a man drowning in guilt. His tie was crooked, his face pale. He glanced over his shoulder before stepping inside. Mr. Thornfield, I need to tell you something that could get me thrown off the board. I poured him a coffee and waited. His hands shook as he held the cup. The fines, he whispered. They're not about community protection. They're revenue. Karen and the board. We've been using them to pay for Raymond's services. The more fines we issue, the more money flows into legal consultations. And she targets people she thinks can't fight back. His words weren't a surprise, but hearing them aloud, confirmation, lit a fire in my chest. Tom, I said carefully, everything you're describing is likely illegal under federal law. Do you understand what that means? He looked up, eyes wide, as if for the first time seeing a door he thought was locked now cracked open. I'd say it's about time someone with real authority stopped them. I handed him a thick folder, case law and statutes neatly organized. Read this tonight, and decide which side of history you want to be on when the dust settles. He left clutching that folder like it was a lifeline. That night, I began drafting the document that would change everything. Marcus J. Thornfield versus Silver Ridge Ranch Community HOA. The complaint was meticulous. Due process violations. Excessive fines. Abuse under color of law. Each argument grounded in precedent. Each accusation built like a stone wall no flimsy HOA could scale. By midnight, the complaint was finished, printed on the last stack of official letterhead I'd kept from the courthouse, sealed in a manila envelope addressed to the U.S. District Court in Austin. I stared at it, my hands steady, my chest heavy. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about every resident who had lived in fear of an envelope on their porch. Tomorrow, Silver Ridge would no longer be just a ranch community under Karen's thumb. It would become a federal case, and this time, the judge wouldn't be sitting at the bench. He'd be the plaintiff. The drive to Austin felt like stepping back into a life I'd sworn I left behind. My pickup rolled past wide fields and lonely highways, but my mind was already in that limestone courthouse, the place where truth wasn't decided by gossip or intimidation, but by law. The manila envelope sat on the seat beside me. Inside it, 30 years of my experience condensed into a complaint sharp enough to cut through every sham rule Karen's HOA had built. When I pulled into the courthouse lot, I sat for a moment staring up at the columns I knew so well. The building hadn't changed. Bronze doors, stone steps, a quiet authority that didn't need to shout to be felt. I straightened my tie, picked up the envelope, and walked inside. The security guards spotted me instantly. Their professional nods softened into smiles. "Judge Thornfield," one said warmly. "Good to see you again, sir." I hadn't been called that in years, but the respect in their voices reminded me that authority, real authority, wasn't taken. It was earned. Inside the clerk's office, Maria looked up from her desk, and her face lit up with recognition. "Judge Thornfield, I thought we'd only see you again for reunions. What brings you here today?" I handed her the envelope, with steady hands. "Filing a civil rights complaint, personal capacity, but I think you'll find it interesting." She slit the seal, skimmed the header, and her smile vanished into something sharper. Her eyes lifted to mine, filled with quiet respect. "Silver Ridge Ranch Community HOA," she read aloud. Well, this is going to get people's attention. By the time I drove back to the ranch, the machine was already moving. Federal. Court doesn't work like HOA theatrics. It works fast when rights are at stake. My request for an emergency injunction would land on Judge Peterson's desk before nightfall. And if I knew him as well as I used to, he'd recognize what this case really was, a neighborhood dictatorship dressed in bylaws. Betty was waiting on my porch when I got home, casserole dish in her hands, eyes wide with anticipation. "Well?" she asked, practically vibrating. "It's filed," I said simply. Her shoulders sagged in relief. Then she grinned. "Marcus, you don't know what's been happening while you were gone. Karen called another emergency board meeting. She's panicking. People are whispering that something big is coming. Tom's been asking where you are." I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Tom. 1 text. "Whatever you're planning, I'm with you." The timing couldn't have been better. By late afternoon, the community center was bursting at the seams. Word had spread that the board was about to drop the hammer on me. Karen stood at the head table, flanked by Raymond Cole, who'd driven down again from Austin, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She looked more rattled than usual, but still defiant, her voice loud enough to shake the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot allow defiance to undermine our community covenant. Despite repeated notices, Mr. Thornfield refuses to comply. Tonight, this board will authorize immediate foreclosure proceedings." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors who'd once avoided my eye now looked at me directly, fear written across their faces. Raymond stepped up, his practiced tone back in play. "The board has every right under Texas law to pursue foreclosure for unpaid fines. It is our legal duty to enforce compliance." Karen nodded furiously, clinging to every word. "We will not tolerate lawlessness in Silver Ridge." My phone buzzed. I stepped outside to take the call. Maria's voice came through, steady and sure. "Judge Thornfield, I thought you'd like to know. Judge Peterson signed your temporary restraining order an hour ago. All HOA enforcement is frozen until next week's hearing." I smiled, the weight lifting off my shoulders. "Thank you, Maria. Tell him, thank you." When I walked back into that meeting, Karen was mid-sentence, fire in her eyes, declaring they'd be seizing my property. That's when I stood, slowly, calmly, and walked to the front. "Karen," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 3 decades behind the bench. I'm afraid you won't be foreclosing on anything. The room fell silent. In fact, I continued, pulling a folded document from my jacket, as of 1 hour ago, the Silver Ridge HOA is under federal injunction. All enforcement actions are suspended pending a civil rights hearing. I laid the order on the table in front of her. She stared at it like it was written in another language. Her lips moved, but no words came. Raymond reached for it, his confident smile evaporating as his eyes scanned the judge's seal. His hand trembled. When he set it back down, I turned to the residents, my voice steady. My name is Marcus J. Thornfield. Until 8 years ago, I was a federal judge for the Western District of Texas. And what's been happening here isn't governance. It's the systematic violation of your civil rights. That ends today. For a heartbeat. Silence. Then whispers. Murmurs. A wave of realization crashing over the room. People who had been silent for years suddenly found their voices. Betty's smile glowed like a lantern in the dark. Tom Carter sat straighter than I'd ever seen him, his relief visible from across the room. Karen tried to speak, but her voice cracked. This is irregular. You can't just barge into an official meeting and... I cut her off, placing a certified copy of the order into her shaking hands. This isn't irregular, Karen. This is federal law, and it outranks your HOA covenant every time. The residents leaned in, watching the empire Karen had built tremble under real authority. And in that moment, I knew. The balance of power in Silver Ridge had shifted forever. The silence after my announcement felt heavier than any gavel I had ever dropped. 100 neighbors sat frozen, their eyes darting between Karen, Raymond, and the document on the table. The board's power had always thrived on fear, but fear has a short life once truth steps into the room. Karen's face shifted through every shade of disbelief, confusion, rage, denial. Her manicured hand trembled as she gripped the restraining order. This isn't valid, she stammered. It needs to be reviewed by counsel before... Karen, I said quietly, leaning closer. That signature belongs to a sitting federal judge. This order is law. And as of this morning, your board answers to the Constitution, not to your whims. The words hung in the air like a bell tolling. Raymond cleared his throat, his voice losing its polished confidence. Judge Thornfield, I wasn't aware of your background. This situation clearly requires more careful... But the room wasn't listening to him anymore. The residents were stirring. One man stood from the back row, his voice shaking with years of bottled resentment. What about the fines you hit us with for our mailbox? Are those even legal? Another voice rose from the side. You forced us to tear down our kid's playset. Said it wasn't pre-approved. Was that a lie, too? The floodgates opened. Questions poured in, frustration spilling like water from a cracked dam. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to speak. They were demanding answers. Karen slammed her hand on the table, desperate to regain control. Enough! This meeting is not a forum for complaints. We are here to enforce... Tom Carter's voice cut through hers, louder and stronger than I'd ever heard it. No, Karen. We've been enforcing your will for too long. Every eye turned to him. His face flushed, but he didn't falter. I've sat on this board for 2 years, watching us bully our neighbors with outrageous fines and threats. I kept quiet because I was afraid. But Judge Thornfield is right. We've been wrong. We've been violating people's rights. The room erupted in murmurs. Karen's mouth fell open. Tom pushed back his chair and stood tall. I resign from this board, effective immediately, and I'll testify to everything I've seen, if it helps put an end to this abuse. The effect was electric. Jennifer Walsh, sitting rigid beside him, lowered her head before speaking. I never wanted to go along with this either. Karen, you threatened to rip up my rose garden when I disagreed. That's not governance. That's blackmail. I resign too. Gasps filled the room. David Morrison, the third board member, stood last, his voice subdued. I went along because I didn't know better. But after tonight, I can't pretend anymore. I resign. Karen spun toward them, her voice shrill. You can't just abandon your duties. This board is legally binding. No, Karen, I interrupted gently. The covenant may be binding, but your power is gone. Federal law doesn't bow to intimidation. Not yours, not anyone's. Her lips trembled, searching for words. But all around us, the community was shifting. Neighbors, who had once sat silent, now leaned forward, whispering to one another with something new in their eyes. Courage. Betty Martinez stood proudly, her voice rising above the noise. We've been living in fear of this board for years. Tonight, that ends. We don't need threats to be a community. We need fairness. We need respect. Cheers broke out. Small, at first, then swelling, until the room buzzed with energy. For the first time, the fear was gone. Karen sank into her chair, her empire collapsing in front of her. Alone at the head table, her allies gone, her lawyer silent, her neighbors awake. Raymond leaned toward her, his voice low but not quiet enough. Karen, this is beyond us. The board is exposed. If you keep pushing, you'll drag us all down. She snapped her head at him, eyes wild. Don't you dare abandon me. We have the covenant. But the covenant was just paper. And paper burns when set against law. I stepped forward, addressing the residents. You've been told you had no rights, that you couldn't fight back. But tonight proves otherwise. You don't have to accept abuse disguised as rules. The Constitution doesn't stop at your driveway. The applause was loud this time. Genuine. Karen's voice cracked as she made one last attempt. This isn't over, you'll see. We'll fight this in court. I looked her straight in the eye. You're right about one thing, Karen. This isn't over. But the fight won't be in your community hall. It'll be in federal court. And I promise you, that's a battleground you're not ready for. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Some neighbors rushed toward me, thanking me, asking questions. Others formed circles, finally free to share their own stories of intimidation. Betty moved like a spark among them, her voice carrying, her hands on shoulders, reminding them they weren't alone anymore. And there, at the head table, sat Karen, Blackwood, alone, powerless, staring at a piece of paper that had stripped away her throne. She had built her rule on fear. But fear only works until people remember they're free. And tonight, Silver Ridge remembered. The week crawled by like a storm cloud rolling low across the plains. Silver Ridge buzzed with whispers. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me now stopped at my gate, asking questions, offering quiet thanks. For years, fear had sealed their lips. Now, curiosity and courage were breaking them open. Karen, meanwhile, was unraveling. She stalked the neighborhood like a shadow, her once perfect posture sagging under the weight of whispers she couldn't control. Some said she threatened new inspections. Others said she tried to rally support. But the truth was obvious. Her power had cracked, and everyone could see it. Wednesday arrived, and with it, the hearing. I drove to Austin alone, the black suit, jacket hanging from my shoulders like armor. The courthouse loomed ahead, its columns timeless, its silence commanding. I had walked those steps thousands of times, but never like this. Never as the plaintiff. Inside, the air was cool and sharp with old marble. Federal court doesn't waste time on theatrics. There are no binders stacked for show, no inflated speeches about property values, just law, truth, consequence. Karen sat at the defendant's table, her face pale, eyes darting. Raymond was beside her, silver hair immaculate, but his posture tight, his confidence fractured. He'd underestimated me, and now he knew it. Across the room, Judge Peterson took the bench. A colleague I'd known for years. His gaze was steady, his tone deliberate. This is Thornfield versus Silver Ridge Ranch Community HOA. Civil rights complaint. We'll begin. I rose, the weight of 30 years guiding me. My voice carried, calm but sharp. Your Honor, this case is about power, without restraint. An HOA that fined a man $250,000 for a simple fence, denied him due process, and threatened foreclosure without lawful authority. But it is more than that. It is about a pattern of intimidation that turned neighbors into prisoners in their own homes. I laid the evidence out methodically. The rewritten bylaws that stripped away appeals, the financial records funneling fine revenue into legal pockets, the testimonies of residents too scared to speak until now. Each document landed like a hammer blow. Each precedent I cited cut through the board's defenses like wire under strain. Raymond stood to respond, his tone polished but brittle. He spoke of covenants, community standards, protecting property values. But his arguments fell flat in a federal courtroom where intimidation meant nothing. Judge Peterson's questions came swift and precise. Mr. Cole, explain how a $250,000 fine for a wooden fence is proportional under due process. Raymond hesitated, stammered. It was about setting precedent, Your Honor, to maintain community. Precedent? Peterson cut in. You're not a court. You're a homeowners association. Answer the question. Proportionality. Silence. Karen shifted in her seat, her nails digging into the table. I watched as the illusion unraveled. In Silver Ridge, their power had been absolute because no one questioned it. But here, under oath, under scrutiny, their empire crumbled. By noon, the case was clear. Judge Peterson leaned forward, his tone final. This board has systematically violated due process rights, imposed excessive fines, and abused authority under color of law. The evidence is overwhelming. Effective immediately, the Silver Ridge Ranch HOA is dissolved. A federal monitor will be appointed, an audit will be conducted, and restitution will be paid to affected residents. The gavel struck once. Sharp. Final, Karen's face drained of all color. Raymond dropped his pen, shoulders sagging. The courtroom was silent, but not with fear, with awe. The kind of silence that comes when truth has finally been spoken. As I walked out, people I didn't know stopped me in the hall. Strangers who had sat through the hearing with wide eyes, nodding at every word. Some shook my hand. Others whispered, "Thank you." On the courthouse steps, the sunlight hit me like a blessing. The fight wasn't over. Audits would come. Money would be returned. Systems rebuilt. But the heart of it was done. Silver Ridge was free. Driving home, I didn't feel triumph. Not really. What I felt was something quieter, deeper, relief, gratitude, justice. Because justice isn't about winning. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. And in Silver Ridge, justice had finally come home. The drive back to Silver Ridge felt different. The same fields, the same winding roads, but the weight was gone. For the first time in months, maybe years, the land felt open again. Free. When I pulled into my ranch, the fence still stood where I had built it. Weathered cedar posts, rails firm, cattle safe. A simple thing, but no longer a symbol of defiance. Now, it was proof that truth had outlasted tyranny. Word spread fast. By the time the sun dipped behind the pastures, Silver Ridge was buzzing. Neighbors gathered in driveways, voices rising with relief instead of fear. Children played outside again, laughter carrying through the dusk like a hymn. For years, every backyard had been shadowed by the threat of violations. Tonight, those shadows were gone. The next morning, the federal monitor arrived. A man named James Caldwell. Steady, no nonsense, the kind of presence that quiets. A room without raising his voice. He called a town meeting at the community center. "This HOA," he said, his voice steady as stone, "is dissolved, effective immediately. Restitution will be made, records will be audited, and governance will be rebuilt. This time, by you. Gasps, then cheers. People looked at one another, wide-eyed, realizing the grip was gone. For the first time in years, they had a say. Caldwell read the numbers like scripture. Over $450,000 in fines collected unlawfully. Every cent will be returned with interest. Families forced to remove improvements will be compensated. And this board's financial dealings will be reviewed for potential criminal charges. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some cried quietly. Others clapped until their hands were red. It wasn't just money being restored, it was dignity. Karen wasn't at that meeting. Word was she hadn't left her house since the ruling. Curtains drawn, lights out. The Queen of Silver Ridge reduced to whispers behind glass. Raymond Cole, on the other hand, tried to salvage his reputation. His firm faced disciplinary review, and word spread that other communities he represented were now facing lawsuits. The shark had bled in the water, and suddenly every neighborhood he'd bullied wanted a bite. Betty sat beside me during Caldwell's meeting, her eyes shining. "Marcus, do you hear it? They're not afraid anymore. They're talking, planning, laughing. It feels like the old days again." I nodded. But inside, a quiet ache stirred. Justice had been served, yes. But justice always came after damage. The scars remained. Tom Carter approached the microphone, his hands shaking but his voice strong. "I want to apologize to this community. I sat on that board too long, watching wrong happen, too scared to stop it. But I promise you this. If you'll have me, I'll help build something better." The applause that followed wasn't just forgiveness. It was redemption. By week's end, Caldwell had organized elections. Real elections. Fair, transparent, every resident given a voice. The new board wasn't made of tyrants in tailored suits. It was neighbors. People who planted gardens, raised kids, cared for cattle. Tom was elected president by a landslide. Jennifer Walsh joined as secretary, her rose garden safe at last. Betty, despite her protests, was nominated and chosen as community liaison, the beating heart of Silver Ridge, now official. And me? I declined any position. I didn't fight to rule. I fought so people could rule themselves, but they still looked to me, asked questions, sought guidance, and every time I reminded them, "Your rights are yours to defend. Don't give them away again." As for Karen, her fall was quiet, but devastating. 6 months after the ruling, her house sold. At a loss. No forwarding address, no farewell, just silence where once there had been threats. I heard later she'd moved out of state. Maybe she thought she could start over somewhere that didn't know her name. But reputations follow, and her education in federal law had been public. Whatever empire she tried to build next would stand on shaky ground. Sometimes defeat doesn't come with shackles. Sometimes it comes with isolation, and that may be the harsher punishment. Life in Silver Ridge shifted. Yards bloomed with gardens no one feared to plant. Playsets stood tall in backyards, children's laughter spilling late into summer evenings. Fences went up, some neat, some crooked, but all chosen by the people who lived behind them. And the meetings? They became conversations, not trials. Disagreements settled with compromise, not threats. The community began to resemble what it was always meant to be, neighbors, not subjects. One night, as the cicadas sang and the cattle settled, Betty brought another casserole to my porch. She leaned back in her chair, smiling at the sound of kids playing down the street. "Marcus," she said, "I think you gave this place its soul back." I shook my head gently. "No, Betty. I just reminded them it was theirs all along." The stars came out slow over the Texas sky, and for the first time in a long while, Silver Ridge felt like home again. The months that followed felt like a season of healing. Silver Ridge was no longer a place ruled by paper threats and whispered fears. It was becoming what it should have been all along, a community. The audit uncovered everything I had suspected. Nearly $500,000 siphoned out of families' pockets through intimidation, channeled into legal fees and Karen's pet projects. It was all ordered returned, every cent with interest. Watching families receive checks in the mail was like watching chains fall away. Tears, hugs, relief. Some used the money to fix homes long neglected. Others invested in gardens, fences, playsets, the very things Karen had once crushed. Betty joked one afternoon as she watched neighbors painting a new playground. "It's like we've all been let out of jail." She wasn't wrong. The new board didn't rule with fists. They governed with conversations. Neighbors disagreed, argued, even debated fiercely. But they did it together, without fear of fines or foreclosure lurking behind every word. For the first time, residents trusted that their voices mattered. Tom Carter proved himself worthy of redemption. As president, he pushed for transparency, making every decision public, every document available. He'd seen what secrecy bred. He wasn't about to repeat it. Jennifer Walsh tended her roses without looking over her shoulder. Betty, though reluctant, became the glue of it all, the voice that carried truth from porch to porch. And me? I went back to my cattle, to my fence, to my mornings on the porch with coffee in hand, watching the sun climb over fields that now felt lighter. I had no interest in holding office. I had held enough authority in my life. My role had been to strike down injustice when it rose, and then step back so others could breathe free. Karen left quietly, her house sold, her name etched into memory, not as a leader, but as a cautionary tale. The woman who mistook intimidation for power, who thought fear could last forever. But fear never does. Raymond Cole's law firm faced inquiry after inquiry. Other neighborhoods came forward, emboldened by Silver Ridge's stand. His empire of intimidation crumbled, one case at a time. I heard whispers of disciplinary proceedings, of lost clients, of a career built on fear finally paying its price. The ripples spread further than Silver Ridge. Letters arrived, emails, messages from communities across Texas and beyond. Stories poured in from people living under the same shadow. Arbitrary fines, threats of foreclosure, lives micromanaged by boards that had forgotten they were neighbors first. They wrote to say our story gave them courage, that they were ready to fight back. Betty liked to say, "One fence saved 1,000 yards." Maybe she was right. But for me, it was simpler. Every morning, I'd walk to that cedar fence, run my hand along the rails, listen to the cattle stir in the early light. To them, it was just wood keeping them safe. To me, it was something more. A reminder that freedom, like fences, requires maintenance. Neglect it, and it falls. Protect it, and it stands. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it stands quiet, steady, unshaken. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Betty sat with me on the porch. She leaned back in her chair, casserole dish balanced on her knees, and sighed. "Marcus, I hope you know what you've done here. People aren't afraid anymore. They're proud. This community finally belongs to us again." I sipped my coffee, watching the stars begin their slow reveal. "It never stopped belonging to you, Betty. You just needed to remember." She smiled softly, and for a moment, all was still. The cicadas sang, the cattle lowed, and Silver Ridge breathed like a place, finally at peace. As the months rolled on, I kept the black suit jacket hanging in my closet, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder that retirement doesn't excuse silence, that justice is not just for the courts, it's for the porches, the fences, the backyards where ordinary people live their lives, because tyranny doesn't always come wearing crowns. Sometimes it comes with clipboards and covenants, and the only way to stop it is to stand. The fence still stands on my ranch, solid, weathered, true. It keeps my cattle safe, and every time I see it, I remember the lesson carved deep into those. Cedar posts. Freedom is simple, but it is never free. You've heard this confession. Now wait until you hear the next one.